Hi there, my name's Alan McDonald. I'm from the British Geological Survey, and I'm going to talk to you today about the role of groundwater and catchment functioning in the Eddleston catchment of Scotland. It's really good to be with you today at the IH conference in Ireland. So this is work that's been done over the last 10 years with a good number of people. There's myself and Breege and Nicola Archer from BGS, Leah Peskett from Edinburgh University, and Andrew Black from the University of Dundee. So we've been working in the Eddleston catchment for the last 10 years. It's about 30 minutes drive or so south of Edinburgh, and it's a 60 square kilometre catchment in headwaters of the River Tweed, with a fairly typical topography for the southern uplands. You can see there in the picture on the top right. We've been monitoring the surface water in about 11 stream gauges, and you can see here one of the records for one of them outlet the catchment since it started in 2011. We've also been monitoring groundwater and carrying out lots of different experiments in this catchment. We started off the work by redoing the mapping the geology for the area. On the right there's a geological map by Clive Otten of the superficial deposits, and the light blue here shows the glacial till on the west side of the catchment. Through the middle we've got a lot of glacial fluvial sands and gravels and the alluvium down the river channel itself. And on the east side of the catchment there's less superficial deposits, and you have the Silurian Ordovician grey wackies exposed there in the kind of upland area. We also did a 3D geological model of part of the area as well to give us a lot more information. So that's how we started off our work. So I want to tell you about 4 of the experiments that we've carried out across the catchment. So the first one is looking at the infiltration to groundwater. So looking at soil permeability and how land use and geology controlled infiltration. The second experiment, close by to that first one, was looking at how floodplains mediate the coupling between hill slope water and the river flow. And the third one was looking at how a forest strip affects both soil water and groundwater dynamics in a catchment. And forest strips are quite important part of a natural flood management, so it was quite an interesting experiment for us to carry out. Then fourthly, we're looking at how groundwater is impacted during storm events, and we looked at 3 subcatchments, 2 in the west and 1 in the east. So the first experiment, looking at groundwater infiltration, and really the main aim here was to look at how particularly woodland affected soil infiltration. And we're quite fortunate in this area. There were lots of different types of woodland to look at. So we had these kind of paired sites between here, a kind of 400-year-old broadleaf woodland and the grassland. Here was about a 180-year-old broadleaf woodland and grassland. And then about a 40, 50-year-old coniferous plantation grassland. And then down on the floodplain itself, kind of a willow forested area here and the corresponding grassland on the floodplain. So lots of different types of forestry. And this was all designed by geostatisticians to try and get the best information we could from the survey. So here's a picture of the work being done. Some of you might have known Mike Bennell, who sadly died a few years ago, who helped to set up this experiment and was a very large, big figure in hill slope hydrology. So moving straight on to the results, really, this map on the right, it shows the opposite of infiltration. It shows the expected runoff from a rainfall event. So we have blue being very low runoff, so high infiltration, and red being high runoff, low infiltration. So first of all, with the results from the forestry, really, is that these old broadleaf forests had a much greater infiltration than adjacent grassland. So you can see the results down here, the blue for high infiltration and the greens here for lower infiltration on the grassland. And you find that in both ages of the broadleaf woodland. So this old forest really important for soaking up water in the catchment. Again, there's lots of good, interesting implications for that about trying to make sure we maintain our old forests instead of just planting new ones. And then here, the coniferous one, now this is one that surprised us, as really we had no statistical difference between the infiltration in the coniferous plantation and the grassland. And then down on the floodplain, really it was low infiltration all round because of the overbank deposits, the sort of lower silt. So from a land use perspective, these results were really interesting, but some of them possibly not that surprising. However, what was surprising for us was when we just looked at the grassland, we found that the nature of the superficial geology and how that impacted the soil had big impact as well. So not just the land use on top of the soil and superficial geology, but actually when you looked at the geology, then it was impacting infiltration, just the way that it was kind of how the superficial geology was helping control the soil types. So geology and soil is quite important, and that was early on in our work in Eddleston. That really gave us a kind of a push in one direction to start to explore more about the role of these geology and soil on the hydrology. So the second experiment was looking at a floodplain aquifer, and here we had drilled 10 piezometers and lots of geophysics and trial pits to give this 3D geological model of this floodplain as that ever gone down the middle there. So we built this 3D geological model. We'd measured groundwater levels for about 10 years. Got rainfall, got a good weather station, also river stage, top and bottom, and also doing some groundwater chemistry. This is the picture of that floodplain there, and us doing some of the drilling. So what were the results of that experiment? Well, first of all, the groundwater levels next to the river really responded very closely to river stage, and up to about maybe 100 meters from the river. You can see that in the bottom right plot here. The blue here is the river stage, and what we find, these ones close to the rivers, which are the green ones here, kind of rising and falling with the river. There's a bit of time where the groundwater flow was artesian and you've got groundwater flooding, but then after a few days that water had receded and gone back into the river. However, what really interested us was the piezometers at the edge of the floodplain here, where we found that groundwater levels continued to rise for quite a number of days after a rainfall event. And what we were finding here really was that it was a hill slope waters accumulating into the floodplain. And you could get artesian conditions and groundwater flooding at the edge of that floodplain for weeks after a heavy rainfall event, again, depending really on antecedent conditions. And when we dug into it a little bit more, we realized that these permeable solifluction deposits, which we call head in Scotland, it really facilitated this coupling. So these really permeable deposits going quite deep into the floodplain and controlling that kind of response. So the 3D geology here, controlling the flow, but also the geochemistry, which I don't really have time to talk about now, but the biogeochemistry of the floodplain controlled really by the nature of the 3D geology. So you can read all that. I think Breeze wrote that up in a paper, I think last year, the year before, so in the Hydrogeology Journal. You can read more about that. So our third experiment was looking at the effect of a forest strip on the connectivity of flow in a hill slope and how that affected the groundwater. So the picture on the top right kind of shows with an eye of faith what we were doing. There's a forest strip here, and we have one transect going through that forest strip, and then one adjacent to that forest strip through the grassland. This picture below, you can see it in plan, which maybe shows it a bit better, the two transects here beside each other. So we drilled, I think it was about 9 piezometers, 6 on the forest transect and 3 on the grassland. And we had about 7 pairs of shallow, 15 centimeters, and deep, about 60 centimeter soil moisture probes along these transects as well. And this formed quite a part of Leo's PhD. We also put in monthly ERT surveys, which we found really useful, and also the rainfall monitoring at the site to control the inputs. So first of all, to talk through the soil moisture results here, they showed quite a difference between the forest and grassland, which is really what you would expect. So in the forest, you can see that we've got soil moisture deficits here lasting for much longer after after the summer season, so deeper into autumn, and the soil moisture, it dries out a lot more as well. So you've got a lot more storage in the soil moisture, a lot drier soils within the forest compared to the grassland before here. And also when you look at the response, much more flashy response of the soil because it's fully saturated in the grassland compared to the forest. So the drying of the forest soils here much greater and extended much deeper into the autumn compared to the grassland. So when we looked at the dynamics of the system, both of the soil and of the groundwater, we've got a slightly different picture though. And passing through all the results really and just going to our conclusions here, I've got a picture here of the conceptual model through both the forest above here and the grassland below. So first of all, looking at the groundwater levels, you can see that the groundwater levels were generally deeper in the forest strip than they were in the grassland. So you have not only the soil having dried out, but you have much deeper groundwater levels due to the pumping of the forest, of the trees. So you have some impact on the groundwater compared to the grassland. However, when we looked at the dynamics, and by dynamics I mean how quickly did the soil moisture increase and how quickly did groundwater levels respond to a storm event, we actually found that there wasn't that much difference between the forest and the grassland. So soil moisture dynamics were pretty similar in the wettest periods between the forest and the grassland. And we found the same for groundwater. And interestingly, there was a good connectivity of groundwater. So although the groundwater levels were deeper here, actually there seemed very good groundwater connectivity across that forest strip, meaning that hill slope hydrology was really connected. It wasn't interrupted by the forest. So these fragmented forest strips, a lot more research needs to be done here, but certainly from this one, it might only have a limited impact on this connectivity of the catchment and of the groundwater during the wettest periods. We've still got to capture a really intense storm here, this kind of normal type storms. So it'll be interesting to see how this responds to a very big storm. So more research to do there, but certainly it seems that they're not having a big influence on overall connectivity, but there is differences within the forest itself. So the fourth experiment was looking at how groundwater responds during storms. And here we looked at 3 catchments. There's 2 in the west, so these 2 here, and 1 in the east, which is this one here. And they had different proportions of forest on them. So the 2 in the west were very similar in terms of geology, one with almost 100% forest cover, and the one next to it with only 50% forest cover. And then the one in the east having virtually no forest cover, but also didn't have any superficial deposits. It was straight onto the weathered bedrock itself. So a different geological environment. So there was weekly monitoring for 2 years. And during the storms, I think we captured about 7 storms. There was hourly monitoring. And what we looked at here was the water isotopes, so oxygen 18 and deuterium, and also acid neutralizing capacity, so like alkalinity. And we also, of course, had stage measurements during the storms and for the whole period. So we're really trying to work out what the proportion of old water in the soils and groundwater came into the rivers during a storm. So looking at the results then. So these tracers, there's a lot of work done by Leo to try and distinguish between the soil water, the event water, which is a kind of rainfall, and groundwater using all these different tracers. And the hydrographs on the right here show the results. So these two here on the left, Middleburn and Shiplaw, are the western catchments, which are the forested ones. And what you can see here is a certainly noticeable difference between the one that was 100% forested to the one that was 50% forested. See how there's more event water, rainfall, in the one with less forestry. So this is telling us that forestry is having an impact here on the amount of rainfall getting into the river, the proportion of event water getting into the river. So that's good. That's showing that there's maybe more water storage. But we found a different story, a completely different story for the one on different geology, which we shows that actually there's much less event water in total, and it rises much more slowly here. And we think this is due to a lot of weathering in the shallow surface of the bedrock, and more groundwater storage in this catchment, and soil storage, which you can see below here, that the sort of greater component of groundwater and a much flatter storage of the soil water. So this is really telling us the importance of geology and soil here in controlling the release of event water. Again, pointing towards the fact that geology and soil seem to be exerting more of a control here than the land cover. And probably one of the most important takeaways, which I maybe should have mentioned first, is that look how across all the three examples, it's actually old water that is a dominant factor. So more than 50% of the water in the stream during a storm event is actually old water. It's not the rainwater that's fallen from the sky. It's that's stored in the soil and in the groundwater. And that's really important for when you think how you're going to actually design a flood alleviation scheme. So moving rapidly on to the conclusions then, and I appreciate there's kind of four different experiments I've rattled through there. But first conclusion really is that this 10 years of monitoring has been fantastic to help understand what the system's like, and really a shout out to long-term monitoring. Being able to layer experiment upon experiment has really enabled us to have more and more rich insights into this catchment. And then the second point, really, soil type and superficial geology exert a really strong control on the infiltration to groundwater, and possibly in some instances more than the tree cover itself. And the shallow groundwater flow through hill slopes, a number of the experiments have shown that that's really important, particularly during wetter periods as the catchment gets connected. However, there's different dynamics, and it's sort of slower flow and more delayed flow, but maybe for longer. But that this is a very significant part of flow through the catchment. And then this fourth point, that pre-event water stored in the soil and groundwater is the majority of stream flow in this catchment during storms. And this has been found by other people in other catchments as well. And this is important for how you design mitigation schemes. And then also there's work on the kind of floodplains. And this floodplain that we looked at really showed how that kind of mediated the flow, the coupling between the hill slope and river, and provides a kind of buffer to that connectivity. And I'd really like to do some more research on that, looking at how that effect that we see, how that changes as you go to smaller and smaller floodplains. You still see something like that when you've only got maybe a floodplain that's several meters wide, or maybe 10 meters wide or so. So thanks very much for listening. Really appreciate being able to tell you this story, and I hope there's time for some questions soon.